Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We are going to give it a minute or two so everybody can pile in. Thank you for being here. We will start in just a second. Okay. Okie dokie. Welcome, everybody. We'll give it just about one more minute to let people come on in. Do. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome, welcome. I am Jess Roberts. I'm the Director of Habitat Connectivity at Wild Virginia, and I'm super excited for our guest speaker here today. Before we dive into today's topic, I just wanted to give you all a brief overview of how this is going to work. So just wanted to let you all know that this is being recorded for our Wild Virginia's YouTube channel, and also will be given out to attendees to this webinar afterwards in a follow-up email. So please be aware that it is being recorded. Also, I wanted to let you know that if you have any questions during the webinar, please do feel free at any time during the talk to put them into our Q&A section. And we will be having a Q&A section at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. So please, if you can, don't put them in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A section so we can keep track of them and make sure we answer them as to our best of our ability. But again, you can put them in that Q&A section at any time during the webinar, and then we will get to them at the end of the webinar after Jackie's talk. But welcome, and we are excited to have you here. This is going to be a great talk. So, okay, let's get into it. So we're very excited to have Jackie here, who works for the Department of Wildlife Resources, and she is going to talk about the elk conservation program going on down there. And she obtained her master's degree from the University of Georgia, focusing on whitetail deer movements and hunting impacts. And she is also an avid hunter herself, which is really exciting and great to hear. We love to keep our hunting community going strong. And yes, she is the expert on elk in Virginia, and we're super excited to have her here. And we wanted to also have her here because it has a really huge direct link to our habitat connectivity program here at Wild Virginia, which Jackie will talk a little bit about and I will talk about, but we would really love some underpasses and overpasses for elk in the southwest of Virginia to keep them safe and to keep drivers safe, but we will go into that through Jackie's talk in a little bit afterwards. But do know that the Virginia Elk Program and Wild Virginia's habitat connectivity work is very much so linked, and so we're very excited to have her here. So take it away, Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. And thank you so much to you all for signing up for this webinar. I'm really excited. I'm going to talk about a couple of different aspects of the elk program and finish out with the elk and roadway stuff. But first, I wanted to start off with history of the elk program. So, a lot of people don't realize that elk are a native species to North America. And when the colonists came over to North America a couple hundred years ago, there would have been elk everywhere. In fact, it's thought at that time there would have been more elk than white-tailed deer. So the estimated population at this time, so like a couple hundred years ago, say like 1600s, was about 10 million elk, and their historic range is kind of outlined in that gold color there on the map. But unfortunately, like a lot of our species that are common today, like whitetail deer and turkeys, elk were overhunted. And you can directly correlate as the human population increased, during that time, the elk population decreased. And really during that time, people didn't realize that there were limits to our natural resources. To them, it seemed limitless, but unfortunately, they found out the hard way that that was not the case. So basically, due to overhunting that wasn't regulated at all, and also drastic changes in the land that, the colonists kind of did when they came over here and started living here, really led to the elk meeting their demise. So by the late 1800s, there were no elk left in the eastern part of the United States. Um, and when we look at Virginia in particular, so the historic range in Virginia was actually the Piedmont West. It's thought that most elk would have occurred west of the Blue Ridge, but the last elk that we can document in Virginia was in 1855, all the way up in Clark County. So we went a couple of decades without elk in Virginia. And then in the early 1900s, so like 19 teens, even throughout 1930s, there was an elk restoration attempt. And this actually started before our agency became established. So our agency became established in 1916, and elk restoration efforts date back to 1913. So there were private individuals in Virginia that were getting shipments of elk from Yellowstone National Park. So Yellowstone had a burgeoning elk population. They had so many that they actually were trying to get rid of them, and there were a lot of eastern states that wanted them. So private individuals are getting these shipments, but then as soon as our agency started in 1916, that was basically the first thing we did. And when I say we, obviously I wasn't around, but the first thing our agency did was jump into this elk restoration and help. So elk were kind of puked up all over the landscape, for lack of better words. There were a lot of different restoration sites, but the unfortunate thing back then is, the field of wildlife management really actually didn't become a thing until the 1930s. People really had no idea what they were doing back then. They didn't know what elk needed habitat wise, or really how to go about this in a way that would be successful. So I usually tell folks to kind of illustrate that one of the restoration sites during this time was on Virginia Beach. And I usually get a chuckle when I tell people that, because obviously looking at this map, it was not part of, the elk's native range in the first place. So that was set up for failure. But even the restoration sites within Virginia that were within the elk's native range, at that time, the natural habitat was just not very good for elk. So unfortunately, they were put on the landscape, and most of them just went straight to, agricultural areas, fields and orchards, and it just caused damage where people really didn't want them to be. And so, people kind of took matters into their own hands. A lot of them killed them legally, but also illegally. And that's really why the elk restoration during this time period did not work. The elk, they persisted in the Giles Bland area, as well as the Botetourt and Bedford area the longest. But by 1970, in both of those areas, there's no documentation of any elk occurring. Um, so a couple more decades passed, and Kentucky started their massive elk restoration project from 1997 to 2002. They translocated over 1,500 elk from 6 different western states and put them into the eastern third of their state. So this was a massive undertaking. Kentucky has a 16 county elk management zone. They had 8 different restoration sites where they put elk. And basically right away when they started doing this, we had elk moving over the border into Virginia. And there were mixed feelings on what to do about that here. At first, the really people tried to actively avoid elk from establishing. Elk hunting was legalized in every county in Virginia. And our staff even worked with Kentucky wildlife staff to trap elk that wandered over to Virginia and transport them back to Kentucky. But they quickly realized that that was not going to be feasible way of moving forward. So um, And so another contradictory thing happened. So basically, there were some people, obviously, that didn't support elk being here, but there are other people that did. And so some people kind of spoke up and said, hey, we don't want these elk to be killed the second they walk over the border. And that actually prompted our agency to work with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation to do an elk restoration feasibility study. So this happened around the same time that all this was occurring. And essentially, what that was is we contracted Virginia Tech to look at the biological and the social aspects of a lot of places throughout Virginia to see if basically, can we do what Kentucky just did? Can we restore elk, both from, kind of a habitat perspective, but also just for, social reasons as well. So that report is actually available online if you guys are interested in reading it, but essentially what they concluded is there's plenty of areas throughout Virginia that were suitable biologically. However, the social reasons is the reason why Virginia did not move forward with an elk restoration at that time. There was a lot of support for elk, but there was also a lot of non-support as well, and it just wasn't, folks that really didn't want to go down that road. So another decade passed, actually, it was 2009. The board of our agency revisited this idea of elk in Virginia. And the reason is they were seeing the success that Kentucky was having. People were coming to see elk, they were coming to hunt elk. They weren't having the negative impacts that some folks thought they might have, like through disease or through conflict. And really, Buchanan County kind of spearheaded this. The Buchanan County wanted it. They came to the state and they're like, please let us do this. We want to have elk in our county. And so the board of our agency directed the staff to create an elk restoration plan. In 2010, there was an elk restoration plan adopted. And so by 2011, we had an elk restoration zone, which was Buchanan, Dickinson, and Wise counties. Elk hunting was prohibited in those three counties. And then the restoration site where elk would actually be trapped in Kentucky and brought to was chosen to be in Buchanan County. And I have that particular spot is where that red star is on the map. So during a 3-year period, 2012 to 2014, elk were trapped in Kentucky and brought over to Virginia. This was a collaborative effort, obviously, with Kentucky Fish and Game and with our staff, as well as the USDA and the Departments of Agriculture in the states. So there were a total of 75 elk that made the trek over to Virginia during this 3-year time span. And it's important to note that these elk had to be held in a quarantine pen in Kentucky. It was a 90-day period for the first 2 years and then a 45-day period the last year. And this is when, they were tested for a lot of different diseases. And the Department of Ag was a part of this. And the elk had to receive a clean bill of health before they came over to Virginia. So to the best of our ability, we released 75 healthy elk, and it was on a reclaimed mine site in Buchanan County. So I wanted to talk just very briefly here about the restoration zone and why those 3 counties were chosen. So for starters, these 3 counties are the only counties in Virginia that are predominantly Appalachian Plateau. And historically, their economies are driven by coal mining. As soon as you get out of those counties in Southwest Virginia and go to any other surrounding county, you're in a ridge and valley and you're in cattle country, basically. So you have agriculture-centered economies. But where we have these, the coal fields, basically, of these 3 counties, really, it was ideal for a couple different reasons. One, you have a low human density, low potential for conflicts with elk. 2, reclaimed mines actually provided a perfect opportunity to manage for elk habitat, which I'll talk about in detail in a couple slides. And these 3 counties are connected to Kentucky's elk population, which is really important from a population sustainability perspective. So really, all these reasons combine to make those 3 counties ideal. And, to top it off, Buchanan County is the one that came to the state and wanted elk restoration in the first place. So I just wanted to make a point that Virginia is not unique in that we use the coalfields regions for elk. Kentucky has, you can see on the map there, they have the largest elk management zone, which is highlighted in red. Green actually represents the historic range of elk. And Kentucky has the largest elk population east of the Mississippi River, and they probably always will because they have the most reclaimed mine land to offer as elk habitat. But West Virginia is actually in the middle of an elk restoration. They just got a new shipment of elk this past winter. And there's also some reclaimed mine land areas within other elk restoration areas within the Southeast. So, elk habitat. So, why are reclaimed mine lands ideal for elk habitat? Well, there's really two main components of elk habitat, and that is open areas and forested areas. If you have ever gone to Buchanan County, you would understand that there's no shortage of forested areas. That county is pretty much all forest for the most part. And elk need that for thermal cover and for shelter. They wouldn't survive very well on just an endless prairie. But open areas are very important to them, and that's what's lacking in a lot of forested settings. But that's where reclaimed mine land comes in. So um, elk are actually they're herbivores just like deer, but they actually feed on grasses more, which I'll talk in more detail here in a couple slides. But basically, grasses and forbs are what elk are going to be mostly eating, and they're going to find most of that in open areas, and they'll get the most bang for their buck there because you'll have more grasses and forbs in an open type area like a grassland or early successional area. Um, you'll have more of that per unit area than you would in a forested setting, obviously. So where surface mining comes in is that, in Buchanan County, you have, in addition to being very forested, is very, very steep terrain. So the tops of these mountains are, is like a T almost. Um, but through surface mining, through, strip or mountaintop removal, it can actually flatten out, the top of a mountain. And it creates the potential to have a field where you didn't have that potential before. And so that's where basically all the open field type areas that we have elk on are a result of a former surface mine. Now, there's a lot of work that has to go into reclaiming a former mine. But all these pictures that you see up here are all from our elk conservation area, and it was all formerly mined and reclaimed. And then I also have on here water sources. If there is a third component to elk habitat, it's probably water sources. They really love ponds and wallows. So we have a lot of man-made ponds on our elk conservation area. So in terms of what exactly elk are eating, like I said, elk are herbivores, but they eat so much food. They can eat 10 to 20 pounds of food per day, which if you're thinking about that in terms of plants, that's a lot of plants. Um, they eat a lot of grasses and forbs, but they'll also eat things like mast, like acorns. They'll eat those, they'll eat woody browse, pretty much anything that can come from a plant and elk can eat. And on this slide, I just wanted to make the point that the habitat work that we do for elk has a lot of benefits, not just to elk. So elk are what we could consider an umbrella species. What we do for them is good for a lot of other animals. And all of these species that are pictured here are all ones that I've personally seen on our elk conservation area. It's not an exhaustive list, but you might be surprised to see like a wood duck and a spring peeper. But even, these ponds that we make for these elk really attract species like that. It's just really cool to see. Okay, so what I wanted to do here real quick was actually compare and contrast elk and deer. So a lot of people, like when we bring them for tours or, aren't very experienced with elk, they'll say, oh, well, elk are supersized deer, right? Well, it's kind of a simplified way to look at it. So what I wanted to do was just talk about the four main differences between elk and deer. So first off is in diet. So whitetail deer, what we call concentrate selectors, they eat a lot of mast and woody browse, and they eat a lot of forbs and stuff too, but they don't eat a whole lot of grass. So if all the grass in the world ceased to exist, a white-tailed deer could get on just fine. On the other end of the spectrum, you have grazers, so like your bison and cattle. They should be eating exclusively green vegetation, so just grasses and forbs. Elk actually fall in the middle, and if they lean one way, they actually lean more towards the grazer side, but it's that grass component in their diet that is the main difference between them and white-tailed deer. So obviously there's a lot of overlap in diet with elk and deer, but there is a difference there. And then the size, you can't really get away from the size. it's really hard to appreciate how elk or how big elk are if you've never seen one. But the average weight for our bulls here in Virginia is about 750 pounds. Compare that to, you know, a whitetail buck, 150, maybe to be generous, 200 pounds. A calf, an elk calf that is born in May or June will be as big as an adult whitetail deer by their first winter. So that's less than a year it takes them to get to that weight. So social structure, rut behavior. So this is actually very different from white-tailed deer. So elk are true herd animals. So with a very few exceptions, when you see an elk, you are going to see a lot more elk. And you know, white-tailed deer are social animals, but they are not herd animals. So if you see a giant herd of deer in a field, you have a problem. You have an overpopulation issue. But with elk, that is actually not the case. So, you know, it's not uncommon to see a herd of 50 elk or so in the winter, because that's just what they do. You know, all the elk in that area are going to herd up. They're going to stick together. Also during the breeding season, which is called the rut, September and October for elk, they form what are called harems. So an adult bull will actually try to establish his own harem, which will be a group of cows and calves. Usually it's about 15 of them on average. And he will work to defend those cows and calves against other bulls for the entirety of the rut. Now, this is a lot of work for him. And, you know, if you watch these elk over that 2-month period, there's a lot of back and forth. You know, one bull might win out one day, might go rest up, and then come back and have to defeat another bull. It's a constant struggle with these bulls kind of competing to keep harems. But the point here being is that white-tailed deer don't do that. So bucks during the rut, they're kind of nomadic. They go around looking for does. If they find one, you know, they'll probably stay with her for a day, maybe 2 days tops, and then he's going to move on and try to find more does. So that's a lot different than, you know, elk forming these harems. And then lastly is reproductive potential. So elk actually don't have the reproductive potential that white-tailed deer do. Deer, so if a doe is 2.5 years or older and she's healthy, she should have twins every year. Usually yearlings only have one fawn to start out, but white-tailed deer should be having 2 fawns a year. Elk only have 1 calf a year. That's it. There's a less than 1% chance that an elk cow is gonna give birth to more than one calf. So they basically, just from that perspective, have half the reproductive potential that white-tailed deer do. Okay, so this is the last slide on kind of like background info on elk. And I actually wanted to make a point on this slide. So perhaps some of you have heard of the different subspecies of elk. And another thing that I'll get from folks when they come here for tours is, oh man, like I wish I could have seen the native elk that would have been here, you know, a couple hundred years ago. Or they think that, you know, our elk restoration, we use non-native elk to restore to Virginia. That is not true. So the 4 pictures I have up here, I guess I'm trying to prove a point. The 4 pictures I have up here are the 4 subspecies that are still living for elk. You cannot really tell the difference, and neither can these elk. So all of these subspecies can breed and produce more elk, and that's really the definition of a species, is animals that can breed and produce more of themselves. West Virginia is actually using 2 different subspecies to supplement their population, so they don't even really have a true subspecies in their population. And so people actually don't realize there are like 40 different subspecies of white-tailed deer that, you know, no one really talks about. And we've gotten, you know, we've done deer restorations here in Virginia. We've gotten deer from 11 different states at least. And deer were being restored as recently as the 1990s in Buchanan County. So our elk are no less native than our white-tailed deer are. This is the same species that would have occurred natively. Cervus canadensis is the scientific name, and that is the North American elk. Okay, so I want to talk about some things related to our management of elk. And the first thing is our management plan. So all of our major game species, so bear, deer, turkey, and elk, have management plans. And the purpose of the management plan is to set forth goals and objectives for the species in the Commonwealth. And the most important point I can make with this is that this isn't a matter of like us as the department, whipping out our pens and writing down what we want to do with elk in Virginia. This is very much a public engagement process. So the first thing we do is we form a stakeholder advisory committee. We had 17 members on it for our elk management plan, and they represent a lot of different interests and backgrounds throughout Southwest Virginia. So we had landowners, we had nonprofits, sportsmen, agriculture, local government, just you name it. We try to have as many groups represented as possible, and basically they got to sit on this committee for a year or two. They got to learn about elk, talk amongst themselves, learn from our staff, and ultimately by the end of that, they got to vote on the goals and objectives for elk in the Commonwealth. In addition to that, Virginia Tech conducted phone surveys for us. So they did a heavy emphasis on people that live in Southwest Virginia, but they also called people throughout the state. And then lastly, when we come up with our draft plan, we put that out for public comment. And rest assured, we do read every single public comment that we get on those, and we have to address it in some way. Whether we actually change something, because of that, we may or may not, but we have to take each one of those comments into consideration. So this plan is actually available on our website. I would actually encourage you guys to check it out. It's a long document, but it's mostly all background info. If you're looking for like solid info on elk and even just more details on the history of elk in Virginia, it's got a lot of great information in it. The essential goals and objectives boil down to like 2 or 3 pages in there, and it's a bulleted list. But I wanted to point out a few highlights. The first one is, as a result of this process, and this management plan goes from 2019 to 2028. As a result of this process, Buchanan, Dickinson, and Wise counties they remained the counties that we would promote elk in. So there was significant discussion on expanding that and including additional counties, but it was decided to not do that. So that was a significant decision. And also those 3 counties became the elk management zone as opposed to the elk restoration zone. And basically it signified the point in our program where we were transitioning from a restoration phase to a management phase. And with that, probably the last bullet point I want to highlight is no more releases of elk. So a lot of people will ask me, are you guys going to be getting more elk in, or could you move elk around to other parts of Virginia? The answer is no. So at least for the tenure of this plan, we're not bringing elk in, we're not sending them out, and we're not even moving them within Virginia. We're just letting them expand from where they are right now naturally. So those were the 2 probably most significant things that came out of that plan. But I encourage you guys to check that out on our website. So our current population estimate is 250 plus elk. Basically, we're confident we have at least 250 animals. We might be able to update this population estimate here in the next year or so. But for now, we're confident that we have at least 250 animals. And this falls in line with what other states have seen. Elk generally, they're slow to grow, and that's what pretty much all the other eastern states have found that have done elk restorations, but they are steadily growing in population. One of the major things that we work on in the elk program is public access and habitat work. It might surprise you guys to learn this, but our agency actually does not own 1 acre of land in Buchanan County where we have elk. We rely fully on participation from private landowners, which is a crazy concept. The hardest thing for me to learn, or for me to wrap my head around when I came here to work this job, is that a restoration of a species like elk was done on private land. But it has worked out really well in Buchanan County for us. The only publicly owned lands with elk, it belongs to the county, and there's no hunting allowed on those, but we do have a couple of viewing shelters where people can go and view elk. But our private landowner partnerships and agreements that we have are amazing. So the area that I call the elk conservation area earlier is actually all private land, and it's a conglomeration of a lot of different landowners that work with us. So I don't have the time to talk about the details of all the programs that we have that we work with these private landowners on, but I have them listed here. If you guys are interested at all, I'd be happy to go into detail during the Q&A. Okay, so talking about just some elk-related recreation, elk viewing is becoming more and more popular. Every year, it seems like more and more people want to come and view the elk. Brace Interstate Park started doing elk tours almost right away after we started the restoration. We work with them on their tours, and they actually helped us to start a tour program a couple of years ago. So we've been doing tours as well. And the reason why we do tours is because of that private land aspect. So most of our private landowners are good with, people coming out there in kind of a controlled setting, just making sure, people aren't, doing things willy-nilly, just making sure that, there's some sort of structure to it. And so that's why we do these tours, so we can take people on private lands that they otherwise wouldn't be able to be on. We also have our elk webcam, which is a really good opportunity for folks to experience our elk from the comfort of their own home. We actually have people throughout the country that watch our elk cam, which is really cool. Just like our tours, every year we seem to get more and more people that are interested in the cam. In 2022, we got a new camera which had an added sound capability, and we noticed a huge jump in the amount of people that were watching our elk cam after we did that. And then lastly, for the recreation side of things, we have our elk hunt. So this has probably been the most exciting thing in our elk program, at least since I've been here. I've been here from 3 to 4 years now, and we started our first elk hunt in 2022. And so the elk hunt is not about controlling the population at all. We are still encouraging our elk population to grow, and that's why our hunt is very limited. We have 6 licenses, and in order to get one of those licenses, you have to apply in a lottery and you have to be drawn. So it really is a once in a lifetime experience for these folks that get drawn. But the most exciting part for us is that we've reached a point in our population where we're comfortable enough to allow those opportunities for hunters, while not having a negative population impact. And those 6 licenses are for bulls only, again, so we can continue to encourage growth of our elk population and not harvest cows right now. The elk hunt is a lot of fun. We have a check station set up at Southern Gap Outdoor Adventures in Grundy. It's if any of you hunt, and especially if you're older and have experienced that like check station culture, that's what this is all about at our elk hunt. There's a lot of fellowship. We have food and a campfire, and it's just a really cool community event during that week in October. And the last thing I want to talk about with the hunt is another thing people will ask me, or maybe even imply when talking about the elk hunt is, how can 6 random people from who knows where come to a place they've never been and be successful killing a bull elk in a couple days to a week? Well, it's a great question, and this is the answer. Because we have landowners and volunteers in the community in Buchanan County that are so passionate about this elk program that they get involved and they help these hunters, and they don't expect anything in return. Most of our hunters, I think all but one of our hunters this year, hunted with a landowner or a volunteer guide. And so that's what makes this experience, I think, in Virginia for these hunters very unique. I don't know of anything like it in the country where you can go and get this sort of help and assistance in community, and not have to pay anything for it. So this is why our elk program is so special here in Buchanan County. Okay, so I wanted to give credit where credit's due with our partners, because if it was just up to our agency, we probably would not have an elk program, because we just wouldn't have the resources and the energy and the time to do what it takes to have a program like this. And so I wanted to give credit to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Southwest Virginia Sportsman's, a local group in Buchanan County. The Nature Conservancy actually owns and manages a ton of property where we have elk. So their cooperation is amazing. And then Breaks State Park and Southern Gap Outdoor Adventures work with us a lot on elk-related recreation and just a lot of different things. And if I had a logo for the private landowners, that would be our sixth partner that I will recognize. Okay, so I want to jump into the elk and roadways topic now. Um, and I will say, so I started as Elk Project Leader on July 25th of 2021. And up until that point, there had really only been a handful of elk vehicle collisions, and that's spanning 10 to 20 years. Because basically, we've had elk on the landscape ever since Kentucky started their elk restoration. And elk vehicle collisions just really wasn't an issue. It was just something that happened here and there, with no regularity at all. Um, and I didn't even deal with a collision until I was about 2 years into the job. So really wasn't a concern up until pretty much the last year. Um, and the reason is, so we have a 14-mile highway that has the construction started in 2009. And basically, it's in the heart of our elk range. The purpose of the corridor is to connect Elkhorn City, Kentucky to Grundy, Virginia. And this highway, I will say, is a very positive thing for the people here. It's part of the Appalachian Development Highway System, which was kind of created by Congress to connect Appalachia to the outside world, basically, and spur economic growth. This is a lot quicker and efficient means of travel in this area. It's been a great thing for the local people. And there was a 9-mile stretch. Well, let me back up. So construction began in 2009. If you guys remember from the beginning of my presentation, it was actually 2009 when the board of our agency directed our staff to create an elk restoration plan. So basically, you have two separate projects that are spearheaded by two separate state agencies that kind of coincided in time. And so we had, finally there was a 9-mile stretch of this highway was open last year in last November, and they have 5 miles to go to complete, and those will be open in phases in 2025 and 2027. But this is an extremely rural area that this highway is going through, very mountainous. The map at the bottom right is actually from DCR's Conserve Virginia data layer. And the bright yellow represents the natural habitat and ecosystem diversity layer, and the dark yellow represents the protected landscape's resilience. So the reason why I wanted to show that is to show that this area actually is important from, a conservation standpoint. So interestingly, the construction of this road has actually directly led, I'm very comfortable to say this, has directly led to the geographic expansion of our elk population in Buchanan County. Our original release site in a straight line from the closest point on this corridor is about 4 to 5 miles. So it didn't, these two projects didn't occur right on top of one another. But we can look at how elk have expanded and have basically followed the construction of this road. And looking at GPS collar data from the past 5 years on our elk, we can watch that. We can literally watch them following the road construction. And the reason is basically twofold. One, this road, just like it's a great means of travel for people, it's also a great means of travel for these elk. I mean, this terrain, you could probably get a sense of some of these pictures, especially the bottom one there, about the terrain in this area. So these elk are able to cover a lot more area in a lot less effort. They basically walk along the side of this road to get from A to B. And the seed mix that's planted for erosion mitigation along the road, you could possibly, I don't think I could possibly pick a better one when it comes to, planting stuff for elk. And so just to illustrate this point, we've studied, we basically had two different herds in Virginia. We had what we called the War Fork herd back a couple of years ago that stayed around the original release site. Those elk that we had collars on never interacted with the corridor, at least for the length of time we had collars on them. And their home ranges on an annual basis were about 2 to 4 square miles. It was a pretty tight area. But our elk that had GPS collars that did use the corridor area, their home ranges were 28 square miles. So that's the same elk population, same county, just a couple miles away, but basically one one group of elk had this corridor available to them to travel and one did not. So that kind of illustrates how this is kind of a growing problem as this highway is being constructed. So pretty much right when I started this position, people were telling me about this, how this is a problem. You got to get out there and see this. You got to do something about it. So I quickly came to understand, yeah, this is going to be a problem. Um, so I met with the Bristol office of VDOT early in 2022 to talk about this, and they were very receptive. You know, they agreed, yeah, this is going to be a problem. We should try to address this somehow. So they brought in the Virginia Transportation Research Council, and we did a study that the study purpose was to determine potential design, placement, costs, and funding opportunities for wildlife crossing structures on Corridor Q. Um, we kind of have a background of how we landed on that purpose. I don't think I have enough time to get into that. Um, but essentially, we were looking at this specifically on the corridor because we determined that this would be the best approach if you're trying to um, eliminate the opportunity for wildlife vehicle collisions to occur and you want to ensure habitat connectivity for animals. So this study started in 2022 and the final research report was published in October 2023. The cool thing about this is, so I was on the research team along with Bridget Donaldson from BTRC, but we also had two ladies on there from nonprofit organizations. So we had the Wildlands Network and ARC Solutions, and they were very helpful in this research process. And I've got the link there if you guys are interested in checking out this study online. But I'm going to go over the study just very briefly. I don't have time to talk about the ins and outs of it, but I'm going to do my best here with the time I have. So wildlife crossing structures, I just wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page. When we talk about wildlife crossing structures, we're talking about overpasses that get animals safely over top of a road or underpasses that get animals safely below a road. Either way, they're getting to the other side of the road safely. So we actually studied this. So we basically looked at, now there's a lot that went into this analysis, so I kind of have to breeze over the methods, but we had elk GPS collar data. We were able to look at elk use of the roadway. And just as a reminder, this was prior to traffic being open on this road. So we were looking at how the elk were interacting with the road at that point. We looked at habitat and terrain features. We had the engineers at VDOT came out and did a couple site visits to look at, where is it feasible to put a structure. And we also looked at, structure spacing research. There's a lot of research out west, for animals like elk, how far apart should your structures be to accommodate an animal like that and the other animals on the landscape. We didn't want to forget about smaller animals out there either. So a lot of research went into this, and basically we just wanted to come up with an ideal plan on where wildlife crossing structures could go. So we ended up breaking the corridor up into half-mile stretches. And so that's what, all the green areas are. And we basically ranked each half-mile stretch on, all those characteristics that I just talked about. But the structure spacing had to come into play as well. So essentially we came up with 2 overpass locations and 8 underpass locations. Now, this isn't an ideal scenario, looking at what would best accommodate elk and other species out there. We also, the engineers at the Bristol office of VDOT, they worked with us very closely. They even did sketches as to, what these structures would look like. The picture at the bottom is a concept, a 3D concept of what one of these structures would look like. And we even, we have everything outlined in this plan, even down to the length and width of these structures. And a lot of that is based on research. Again, out west, how wide does a structure have to be for an elk to want to go through it? Because if it's narrow and they can't see to the other side, they're not going to use it. We also, this is, most of this analysis. So, our Bridget Donaldson from BTRC did a lot of this. She's amazing. She already had an average deer crash cost that she had calculated, prior to this study. But she was able to apply that methodology and calculate one for elk. The final cost that, we came up with VDOT, looking at each location specifically, basically looking at what the cost would be for a structure, like, and the associated fencing with the structure. Because I should have mentioned this earlier, wildlife crossing structures can be effective in of themselves, but really you have to have wildlife fencing with it, because without it, an animal is going to be motivated to cross a road just as easily where there isn't a structure as where there is. So basically, you're fencing them out of the road completely, but you're providing safe passage for them across the road to ensure that habitat connectivity. So each of these structures with associated fencing was estimated to be between 5 and 6 million. And Bridget calculated the economic gains that would begin exceeding structure costs. So basically, each structure to start to pay for itself, if you want to look at it that way, would have to avoid 2.8 elk crashes or 5.4 deer crashes per year. And that's what's shown on the graph there at the right. And then lastly, our research member from ARC Solutions did an extensive analysis of federal funding programs. So they are the national experts on funding for projects like this. So they looked at that, they looked at our project and looked, specifically what types of programs is this project set up to get funding from. So they reviewed 15 federal discretionary grant and formula allocation programs under the IIJA, which is an Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and prioritized those programs based on our ability to probably get that funding. So in the research report, there's a couple of them listed. I won't be able to go into detail about all of them, but the top one they found for us was the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program. And the interesting thing about where this project would be in Buchanan County is that the fact that it's part of the Appalachian Development Highway System is a major plus for getting federal funding. Some of these programs actually require a certain percentage of the money to go to Appalachian Development Highway System projects. And another thing is that being in an economically disadvantaged area, which that area is, some of the federal funding programs we looked at do not even require a match. We could get 100% of the project funded through federal money. And some of those federal programs require a project to cost a certain amount. So, with a $50 to $60 million price tag, it's actually not out of reach for these federal funding programs that we looked at. So last slide I have on this project, Jess actually said she was going to touch on this at the end of the presentation, so I won't harp on it too much. But basically, we have a web page dedicated to this project on the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors collaborative page. And there's actually 22 supporter logos at the bottom of the page of organizations that supported the study as it was being done. And we've also gotten multiple funding offers from nonprofits that thought we might need a match, which is still possible, that we would need a match. Not all federal funding programs that could fund the project wouldn't require a match. So I just wanted to highlight that support that we had as we were doing this study. And then I have one slide on this. So because I was a member of the research team for the wildlife crossing study, that's why, I went into as many details as I could here. But this study, I was not part of the research team, so I wouldn't be able to give you as many details on it, but I did provide data to these Virginia Tech researchers that were doing this. So VDOT actually had Virginia Tech look at, basically do a feasibility study for animal detection driver warning systems on Corridor Q. And these systems are basically, you have some sort of sensor, can be detected by different things like heat or motion. But essentially, if the system detects an animal on the shoulder of a road, it'll throw up a message to the driver saying, hey, animal detected ahead, slow down or use caution. These types of systems are used out west where you have, especially, migratory cervid populations like elk and mule deer. These researchers have studied their GPS collar movements enough that they almost know the exact spot on a road that mule deer are going to cross every year and the time of year, or where elk are going to cross every year because that's their migration route. And that's where these detections are most effective, is when you know an area that the animals are going to cross in. You can put that detection system up there and try to warn people. Um, but I'm not going to go into a ton of details on this study because, like I said, I'm not as knowledgeable on it, but it is out there. This is the link that you can go and read it. Essentially, what it boils down to is VDOT is interested in trying to do a pilot study for these systems on Corridor Q. I don't have a whole lot of details on, what that's going to look like, or how far along it is, but I have heard that they're interested in that. The wildlife crossings study, at this point, they are not interested in applying for federal funding and trying to make that happen. So you guys might be wondering, so what's happened? Um, the 9 mile stretch of the corridor has been open for almost a year now. And we have had at least ones that we have been made aware of that have been reported to our agency. We've had 9 total elk vehicle collisions since the corridor opened. 7 of those have occurred on the corridor, and 2 have actually occurred on Route 744. And that is a state route that connects to Corridor Q. It's a main point where people are entering the corridor and exiting the corridor. So we've had a lot more traffic on Route 744 since the corridor has opened. All of these collisions have occurred at night, that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of any human injuries that have been reported, which is amazing. I'm very happy about, but there has been extensive vehicle damage. Each elk involved in these situations has died, unfortunately, and we've had a lot of young, healthy animals. Of the 9 total, 5 were calves, so less than a year old. 1 was a yearling, less than 2 years old, and the other 3 adults were still younger, healthy adults, and 1 was a pregnant cow. But this screenshot here, this is actually not a screenshot that I took. This was a screenshot on Facebook that was sent to me by a local landowner in Buchanan County the morning after one of these collisions occurred. So this is just stuff that unfortunately has circulated on Facebook as a result of these collisions happening. And I just wanted to show you guys a map actually of where these collisions have occurred. As you can see, it's almost as if someone took some specified distance and plotted points all along the corridor where these collisions have occurred. So pretty much the whole corridor is a collision hotspot. These elk live along the road. Their whole range encompasses the road. And that's why that wildlife crossing studies aim to try to keep them off the whole road and give them areas to cross back and forth. But we have had one location that's circled in red where we have had 2 collisions almost in the same exact location. And so this is the last slide that I have for you guys. So basically, what's being done at this point? We were able to work with VDOT early in 2024 to get yellow elk crossing signs put up on Corridor Q and 744. So we have those yellow signs out, and recently, actually in September, the Bristol office of VDOT put a flashing light on a yellow elk sign at either end of the corridor. So they're not on every sign right now, but there's one basically on the easternmost portion and one on the westernmost portion that's open to traffic. So the flashing light, and also they temporarily have these changeable message boards up along with the flashing light on the sign. And because these collisions have occurred at night, I would like to think this has helped. I hate to say it out loud, but we have not had a collision that I'm aware of since these flashing lights and changeable message boards have been put up. So I'm hoping that they did the job of alerting people, especially at night when visibility is low. And I'm going to try to work with them to keep the changeable message boards up, or at least get more lights installed on the sign. So that's something that I'm going to strive to do moving forward. Small victories, though. All right. So I have no idea how I did on time. I'm really sorry if I went over, but that is all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in to this presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions. If there's not enough time now to answer all your questions, please take a picture of my email and phone number and send me anything that you have questions on. But thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. So we'll do a couple of questions, and I'll try to answer some of the ones that I know by typing them in while you answer the other ones in. And then, yes, please do, if you have any questions for Jackie, write down that email. We can also provide her email in the follow-up email that we will send out after the webinar, along with the recording of this webinar. And any links she provided, I also have. I just wanted to share with you guys really, really fast our Habitat Connectivity Hub. So I will share that, where you can find a lot of this information on Corridor Q. So I'll put the link to this Habitat Connectivity Hub in the chat, so you guys can head to it. We'll also put it in the follow-up email. But if you go to the Habitat Connectivity Hub, we have a section called Wildlife Crossings Research. So this is just for the state of Virginia. So you can find out all information on wildlife crossings, the current crossings we have in place in Virginia, and the current research to put more crossings in. So all information there. And then I'm going to this section on I was at it, and there it is. On the project on Corridor Q that Jackie was just talking about. So here is the section on elk for Corridor Q. We also link to the actual study that they did right here that you can press. So I'm going to put the link to this in the chat right now, to the Habitat Connectivity Hub. And then if you would like to get involved in advocacy efforts for advocating for more crossings, especially the elk crossings to be put up in Virginia, please go to wildvirginia.org, because that is what we do. So I'll take it away, Darby, for starting off with answering questions.
Yes, so I'll start with the first question that we got, and it's, why was elk harvest immediately legalized as soon as an elk crossed the border? What are the more specific reasons why elk restoration was not done in 2010?
Yeah, so back in it was around the year 2000 is when elk harvest was legalized in every county. And that was meant from discouraging elk from establishing that would have been coming over from Kentucky. So there were, a lot of people back then were not happy about Kentucky's elk restoration, and even more unhappy that elk were coming across the border to Virginia. And it's probably just because the potential for damage that elk can do, especially in an agricultural setting. I'm assuming is why people probably weren't happy about it. So that was why elk harvest was legalized, just to try to make sure elk didn't establish that we're coming over from Kentucky. And it was at that time when, we contracted Virginia Tech along with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation to do an elk restoration feasibility study to see if we can do what Kentucky just did and actually establish our own population. And the reason was just basically the loud voices that were against elk. It's mostly from the agricultural community that we get not support for elk. And, that's even why we just have elk in Buchanan, Dickinson, and Wise counties now, and not in those other counties that are agriculture centered.
And another question that's along the same lines are, why did Kentucky elect to reintroduce elk?
You know what? That's a great question. I actually don't know what their process looked like for deciding that. I would like to assume it's just for the positive aspects of, people coming to view them and hunt them. And elk are just amazing creatures. I mean, they're just majestic and charismatic. People that get to come here for tours and see them, it's always like, for some of them that, especially that have never seen elk before, it's actually very emotional for them. We've had people cry on tours. I think it's just, if you guys have never seen elk, I really encourage you to come and do that. But if you've heard a bull elk bugling in September or October, I think there's a lot of people that are just crazy about that. So
Do we have time for one more question? Okay. Do elk eat invasive plants and grasses, including invasive woody plants like autumn olive?
yeah, that's a good question. The two biggest invasive species that we deal with is Sericea lespedeza and autumn olive. Autumn olive, I can live with because elk actually do eat it. There's a lot of wildlife species that eat it, use it as cover. The problem with autumn olive is that it just takes over. So you have to make sure it's not going to take over the whole area. But if you have it like growing in a reasonable amount, it's actually not a bad plant. So yes, but Sericea lespedeza, no, that is an evil plant. Nothing eats it and gets nutrition out of it. It takes up space from things that could be growing. So that would be my biggest nemesis in terms of plants, would be that one.
All right. I think we have to call it. I'm so sorry. It's 7:30, but have no fear. I again will be putting the links that Jackie provided in the presentation, her email, and really any links that you need and the recording of this video in a follow-up email to you. Thank you so much for being here, Jackie. This was really incredible. Everybody's already thanking you for such a wonderful presentation. And yeah, I hope
Thank
all
you.
of you can go on some elk tours or maybe go in for the lottery for the elk hunt. So yeah, please do keep in touch. And yeah, thank you so much, Jackie. This was wonderful.
Thank you guys. I really appreciate you having me, for being interested.
Yes, of course. All right. Yes, we will stay tuned and we will send out that follow-up email. But thank you, Kylie, and thank you, Quintessa and Darby. This was great. Have a great evening, everyone.
You too.